All right, get ready because today we're going deep on a topic why you guys specifically requested effective study techniques for university students. You sent us a ton of research on this, so clearly you mean business. You want to learn and you want to do it right.
It's a great topic,
Yeah.
honestly, and yet one I kind of wish I had paid more attention to back when I was in university. We were talking about like real strategies backed by research that could totally change how you take in and remember information.
And you really get how the brain works, so I'm excited to hear all about this. Let's start with something that's always kind of fascinated me, active recall. I've tried it a bit with flashcards, but I'm really curious to hear about the science behind it.
The really cool thing about active recall is that it directly goes against our natural tendency to forget things. You see, back in the late 1800s, there was this researcher named Hermann Ebbinghaus, and he mapped out this thing called the forgetting curve. Basically, he found out that we lose information super fast unless we like actively work to hold on to it.
So if I just like reread my notes over and over, I'm basically setting myself up to forget most of it.
Pretty much, yeah. Active recall, though, makes your brain really work those memory muscles.
Hmm.
Instead of just recognizing information, you have to pull it out from your brain, which strengthens those pathways.
It's kind of like the difference between just looking at a map and actually navigating through a city, right? One is passive, the other you got to really engage.
That's a great way to put it. And the more you practice active recall, the stronger those memory pathways get, like building mental muscle.
So besides flashcards, what are some other ways to work active recall into my study routine?
Oh, there are tons of ways. You can try summarizing concepts, but without looking at your notes,
Mm-hmm.
or teaching the material to someone else. You can even just explain it to yourself out loud.
Sometimes I catch myself talking through a tough concept to myself. Guess I was on the right track.
Exactly. Your brain loves to connect things and make sense of them, and that's what active recall is all about.
And speaking of making information stick, that makes me think of another technique you mentioned, spaced repetition. This one I actually know a bit about from language learning apps.
Those apps are a perfect example of how spaced repetition can be used well. Instead of cramming everything at once, you review it at longer and longer intervals. That's how you beat that forgetting curve Ebbinghaus figured out.
So it's like checking in with the material regularly to make sure it's still fresh in my mind.
Precisely. It's like taking care of a garden. You wouldn't plant seeds and just walk away, right? You'd water them, pull weeds, and give them what they need to grow. Spaced repetition is similar. You're taking care of those memories, making sure they really take root and thrive.
I love that. Makes a lot of sense. So would this mean like reviewing a day later, then a week later, then a month later? How do you figure out those intervals?
Well, there are different systems and even apps that can help you out, but the main thing is to space out those reviews based on what you need. If there's a concept you just can't get, you might review it more often. If it's something you've totally mastered, you can space those reviews out more.
Sounds like it's all about being deliberate and listening to what my brain is telling me. Wouldn't this take way more time though? Isn't cramming just more efficient?
That's what a lot of people think. But cramming is really a quick fix that doesn't last. You might remember things for the test, but you'll forget it super quickly after.
Oh, that's definitely happened to me. I've pulled all-nighters before exams and aced them only to completely blank on the material a week later.
Exactly. Spaced repetition takes a little more planning up front, but it's a much better investment in the long run. You're learning for the long haul, and that's what's important.
Okay, you've convinced me. Spaced repetition it is. Now let's move on to another technique that caught my eye, elaboration. I remember reading a study where students who had to explain the WHY behind a historical event remembered it way better than those who just memorized names and dates.
That's the power of elaboration in action. It's about going deeper than just surface level understanding and actually making meaningful connections.
So instead of just taking information in, I need to really work with it and figure out how it all fits together.
Yeah, exactly. It's like the difference between memorizing a recipe and actually understanding the science behind it. When you know why each ingredient is there and how it affects the final dish, you're much more likely to remember it and even change it up to your liking.
And that deeper understanding makes learning fun and actually empowering, right?
Totally. It's about moving from just rote memorization to a deeper level of understanding and really getting into it.
I'm starting to see a theme here. Active recall, spaced repetition, elaboration. It's all about actively engaging with the material, making it mean something and connecting it to what I already know.
You're getting it. Passive learning just doesn't cut it. To really learn and remember information, you need to be an active part of the process.
Okay, this is already making me rethink how I study. Now I want to hear more about another technique you mentioned, dual coding. I've always been a visual learner, so this one really speaks to me.
Dual coding is really interesting. It uses both verbal and visual information. Think about it. Have you ever noticed how it's way easier to remember a scene from a movie than a paragraph describing it?
Oh, absolutely. Those visuals just stick with you.
That's because you're using different parts of your brain. Dual coding isn't just about making things look pretty. It's about creating those strong neural connections by tapping into both your visual and verbal processing systems.
So how do I use this when I'm studying? Are we talking about drawing pictures in my notes?
That's one way to do it. Diagrams, mind maps, even using videos and images in your study materials can all make a difference.
It's like creating a multi-sensory experience for my brain, right?
Exactly. You're giving your brain multiple ways to access and process information, making it much more likely to stick.
This is really cool stuff. I'm already thinking about changing up my study routine. But before I get too excited about flashcards and mind maps, I want to hear more about interleaving. It seems kind of counterintuitive, but also really interesting.
Interleaving is definitely one of those strategies that goes against how we usually think about studying. Instead of spending hours on one subject or topic, you switch things up.
So instead of like a whole afternoon on calculus, I might go back and forth between calculus problems and history readings.
Yeah, exactly. It might feel less efficient at first, like you're always interrupting yourself, but research actually shows that switching gears like that can help you learn better.
Why is that? I have to admit, my instinct is to focus on one thing until I feel like I've got it down.
Think of it like cross-training, but for your brain. Just like an athlete benefits from different types of exercise, our brains do better with variety. Interleaving makes your brain more flexible, adapting to different ways of thinking and solving problems.
That's a great way to think about it. It's like I'm training my brain to be more, I don't know, agile and quick on its feet. But wouldn't all that switching make it harder to really dive deep into one subject?
Actually, it's the opposite. When you come back to a topic after a break, your brain has to work harder to remember the information and rebuild those connections. That effort actually makes your memory stronger over time.
It's like those aha moments you get when you finally figure something out after wrestling with it for a while. Those really stick with you.
Exactly. Interleaving doesn't just improve your memory, though, it also helps you apply what you know in different situations.
I can see how that would be super important at university, where you're always having to connect ideas from different classes.
Absolutely. It's all about building those bridges between different areas of knowledge.
Okay, changing gears a bit, let's talk about something that can help you manage your time and focus better. The Pomodoro Technique.
Ah, yeah, the 25-minute work sprints. I've heard of it, but I've always been a little skeptical. Does it really work? I tend to get lost in what I'm doing and lose track of time.
What's great about the Pomodoro Technique is how simple it is. It's like a little reminder for your brain to stay focused and not burn out. You set a timer for 25 minutes, work on something with full concentration, and then take a short 5-minute break.
I get why that's appealing, especially for someone like me who gets super focused and then crashes. But wouldn't all those breaks interrupt my flow? The trick is to use those breaks well. Instead of jumping on social media or checking email, try stepping away from your desk, stretching, or doing a quick mindfulness exercise. It's about giving your brain a chance to reset and come back recharged.
So it's more about strategic pauses than completely checking out.
Exactly. And the nice thing is that those 25-minute chunks feel really manageable even when you have a huge task. It's all about breaking things down into smaller, less scary steps.
I like that. It makes the whole thing feel less overwhelming. Now let's talk about something that's always intimidated me a bit. Mind mapping. I've seen those crazy diagrams and thought, no way I could ever make something like that.
Mind mapping can seem a little scary at first, but it's a really creative and interesting way to organize information. Instead of just writing linear notes, you're creating a visual map of how concepts connect.
So it's like building a web of ideas with the main topic at the center of it all.
Exactly. It's a much more active and engaging way to capture the main points of a topic.
Mm.
And you can make it your own with colors, pictures, and keywords that work for you.
That takes some of the pressure off. It doesn't have to be this perfect color-coded masterpiece. It's more about creating a visual aid that helps me.
Exactly. Mind mapping is all about using your creativity and making the learning process your own. It can be especially helpful for visual learners, but anyone can benefit from it.
I'm realizing that a lot of these techniques can work together. I can totally see myself using a mind map to organize my thoughts after a Pomodoro session focused on active recall.
That's a great point. The best study strategies often involve combining different techniques to create a personalized approach that really works for you. It's about finding the right tools for the job and using them in a way that feels natural and keeps you engaged.
Speaking of engagement, I know you're a big fan of collaborative learning. What makes studying with other people so helpful?
We're social creatures, and our brains are wired for connection. Learning doesn't have to be a solo mission. When we interact with others, we unlock a whole new level of understanding.
I've definitely had that light bulb moment when a friend explains something in a way that suddenly makes sense. It's like they're holding up a mirror, showing me the concept from a totally different angle.
Exactly. Collaborative learning lets us share ideas, challenge each other's thinking, and figure out where we might have gaps in our knowledge. It's about using the combined knowledge of the group.
And isn't there something about teaching a concept to someone else that helps you understand it better yourself?
Absolutely. When you have to explain something clearly enough for someone else to get it, you have to really think about it and refine your own understanding. It's a powerful way to learn more deeply and gain confidence.
This is making me realize how much I've been missing out on by sticking to my solo study habits. But with so many techniques out there, it can be overwhelming to know where to begin.
That's where the idea of self-regulated learning comes in. It's about taking charge of your learning journey and setting yourself up for success.
So it's not just about using the right techniques, but also about being mindful of how I'm using them and adjusting them to my own needs.
Exactly. Self-regulated learning involves setting realistic goals, planning your study time, tracking your progress, and making changes along the way. It's like being your own coach, constantly evaluating and improving your strategies to learn as effectively as possible.
It sounds like it takes a lot of self-awareness and discipline, but wouldn't that make things even more complicated?
Think of it as an investment in your learning. The more you understand your own learning style, strengths, and weaknesses, the better you'll be at choosing the right strategies and making the most of your study time.
So it's about taking the time to figure out what works best for me and then creating a personalized study plan that I can actually stick to.
Exactly. Self-regulated learning gives you the power to control your learning experience and become a more effective and efficient learner.
I really like that idea of being empowered. It shifts the focus from just getting through the material to really owning the learning process. But with so much information available these days, it's easy to feel overloaded. How do we avoid drowning in a sea of data?
That's such a good question. And it brings us to something really important for effective learning in today's world: managing cognitive overload. Our brains are amazing, but they have limits.
I definitely know that feeling of my brain hitting its limit. It's like trying to fit an entire library into a shoebox.
It's like drinking from a fire hose.
Yeah.
You might get a lot of information, but you won't actually absorb much of it. Cognitive overload is a real thing, and it can make it much harder to learn.
So how do we avoid this information overload? Do we need to become digital hermits and cut ourselves off from everything?
Not at all. It's about being smarter and more deliberate about how we take in and process information. Simplifying complex materials, breaking things down into smaller pieces, and focusing on one concept at a time can make a big difference.
So it's about pacing myself and giving my brain time to process things, not trying to cram everything in at once.
Exactly. And being aware of our digital habits can help too. Setting limits on screen time, minimizing distractions, and creating specific spaces for focused learning can make a big difference.
We've covered so much. Active recall, spaced repetition, mind mapping, the Pomodoro Technique. It's obvious that effective studying is about way more than just passively reading through stuff.
Yeah, totally. It's about really getting involved in your learning, trying out different things, and finding what clicks for you. There's no magic formula that works for everyone.
If our listeners are feeling a little overwhelmed with all these techniques, what should they focus on first? What's the most important takeaway?
I'd say start small and be consistent. Pick one or two things that really speak to you and work them into your study routine. Don't try to change everything at once.
That's good advice. It's like building any new habit, right? Start small, keep at it, and build up from there. What we've been talking about are tools, not rules set in stone.
Exactly. And learning should be enjoyable. Don't be afraid to play around with different things and have fun with it. It's all about discovering what makes you curious and want to learn more.
I love that. It's easy to get caught up in the stress of exams and deadlines, but really learning is a privilege.
It really is. And the more you learn about how your brain works and how to learn better, the more you'll be able to reach your full potential.
Okay, so to sum it all up, effective studying isn't about cramming or just memorizing facts. It's about actively engaging with the material, making connections, and finding what works for you.
And don't forget, all these techniques are great, but the real magic happens when you start mixing and matching them. What works best for you might be a unique combination of different approaches. So think of this as a starting point, not a rigid set of rules.
The most important thing is to be curious, stay engaged, and never stop learning. There's always something new to discover.
Well said. And hey, maybe you'll even find some new study techniques we didn't even talk about today. Learning science is always changing and growing.
That's what's so cool about it. There's always more to learn and new ways to get better. We've just scratched the surface here. There's a ton of resources out there, from books to apps to whole communities dedicated to learning effectively.
So keep exploring, find what works for you, and watch your academic success take off.
That wraps up another deep dive. Until next time, happy studying.